Ladies and gentlemen, the term that the rabbi just used, survival. One of the ways that they attack survival is by a process of what's called delegitimization.
To put it back is to die.
Anything in the media that detracts from the right of the Jewish people to their homeland of Israel is an attack on the survival of the Jewish people. We wrote our book from the point of view of trying to show that media bias is not simply a random collection of different errors and inaccuracies in this story and that story and the other story. It falls into patterns. And we thought that by presenting these patterns from A to Z, we could show you that both in the language and in the perspectives that the media, the mainstream Western media uses, there is a persistent theme of delegitimizing the Jewish people's homeland of Israel. And it can't be countered entirely by writing letters to the editor, as important as that is, about this individual story and that individual story. We have to come to grips with the language. We ourselves have to stop using these terms that are self-disrespecting and delegitimizing, and then we can lean on the media to stop using these expressions, and then I think we will have the end of a campaign of poisoning Israel conducted by the mainstream media. So our theme is that Israel reporting is laced with terms that are loaded against us. And these are just a few of those terms. But the good news is that terms like West Bank, and terms like that, were not written in stone 3,000 years ago. They are post-Israel independence creations. Take, for example, West Bank. The media incessantly uses West Bank. You will not see headlines that say Judea and Samaria. You'll just see headlines that say West Bank, and of course, the text of the stories are in accord with the headlines. Why does the media do this? They like to contrast Jewish settlers in settlements in the West Bank with Arab residents called Palestinian residents of nearby West Bank villages. So all these terms are stacked up against us. The Inquirer, for example, had an article and a photo accompanying the article. The photo had nothing to do with the article. It showed a Palestinian shepherd walks by the Jewish settlement near the West Bank village. Everything they can do to show that we don't belong there. And here's another situation in which they say that Judea and Samaria is the biblical term for the West Bank. So when an Israeli or an American uses the term Judea and Samaria, they are referring to the term that was used thousands of years ago, according to the media. But that is not really the history of those terms. In 1947, the United Nations tried to partition the remaining Palestine mandate between Palestine's Arabs and Palestine's Jews. And the expression that they used was not West Bank. The expression that they used, the United Nations used in 1947, was the hill country of Samaria and Judea. As Ambassador Ettinger of Israel pointed out, that West Bank did not exist as a name until after Jordan invaded and seized it in the 1948 war. That the Turks and the British themselves all used Judea and Samaria because that's what the terms were in the middle of the 20th century. And in my first book that the rabbi kindly alluded to, which traces the history of the Jewish people in the land of Israel for 3,000 years, and they never left. A pilgrim who came on, a Christian pilgrim who came on the heels of the Crusaders right after the first invasion by the Crusaders said, on this side of the Jordan River is the region called Judea, as far as the sea. So Judea and Samaria, and there are tons more examples that I and other people have given, is not the biblical name. It's the name that was in use from ancient times right up until the present. Israel's enemies are going to continue to use the expression West Bank, and the media, not in concert with them, but in common with them, use the term West Bank. And the reason that they do this is because It disassociates the Jewish people from names Judea and Samaria that had Hebrew origins and remained in effect for thousands of years. We have to stop using these terms ourselves. The Romans, you may remember, when they defeated Bar Kokhba in 135, the end of the ancient Jewish independence in Israel, they renamed what had been known as Judea. They renamed it as Palestine for the same reason that the media and the Arabs today rename Judea and Samaria as the West Bank to disassociate the Jewish people from it. What matters most, what matters first, not what the media and the Arabs call Judea and Samaria, but what we call it. How about East Jerusalem? Everybody talks about East Jerusalem, and the Arab initiative of 2002 that Secretary Kerry is dusting off, it talks about East Jerusalem. The media likes to say traditionally Arab East Jerusalem, as if historically and demographically, at least that part of Jerusalem is Arab and not Jewish. But is that really the historical and demographic fact? It is not. In the past 3,000 years, Jerusalem has been the capital of 3 states: Judah, an ancient kingdom; Judea, which was recovered for the Jews by the Maccabees against the heirs of Alexander; and then modern Israel. Those are the only 3 states that have had Jerusalem as its capital in the last 3,000 years. And since ancient Judea was destroyed by the Romans, the next native state in the land of Israel was modern Israel in 1948. Everybody between Hadrian and 1948 was a foreign invader. Palestinian Arabs have not ruled Jerusalem for one day in history, and foreign Arabs ruled it between 638, when they defeated the Byzantines, who were the heirs of the Romans, until the First Crusade in 1099. Everybody before them was not Arab, and everybody after them was not Arab. These are the rulers of Jerusalem in the past 3,000 years, starting from the kingdom of Judah, who were defeated by the Babylonians, who were defeated by the Persians, who were defeated by Alexander and the Seleucids. Then the Jews came back with the Maccabees. They lost to the Romans, who were followed by the Byzantines, who were defeated in 638 by Muslims led by Arabs. But between 638 and 1099, the time of the Crusades, there was a fading of the Arab control of the Muslim dynasties in favor of the Turks. Then came the Crusaders, and the Crusaders' work came Mongol invaders inspired by Genghis Khan. Then Mamluks. Probably you never heard of the Mamluks. The Mamluks were Turks and Circassians. They were not Arabs. They ruled the land of Israel and the surrounding areas for 200 years between the Crusaders in 1517, when the Ottoman Turks took over. Then came the British. Then came Israel and Jordan invaders. So to say that the land of Israel and the city of Jerusalem are historically Arab politically is simply not supported by history. This is the population of Jerusalem from the middle of the 19th century until the present time. I put the Jews in blue because almost all of them were Democrats. But the thing is that the Jews were the plurality during the Turkish time in the 19th century, and an ever-increasing majority since the middle of the 19th century until today. So the Arabs cannot say that demographically Jerusalem has been an Arab city. The great historian Sir Martin Gilbert quoted a 19th century visitor, a doctor, who said, "We typically regard the city of Jerusalem as if it's a Muslim city. But in point of fact, the Muslims don't constitute more than 1/3 of the entire population in the middle of the 19th century." A British consul, a famous British consul named James Finn in Jerusalem, 1858, he said that the Muslims are less fanatical in Jerusalem than in other places. Why is this so? Because they're maybe a quarter of the whole population. What about, you read in the media that in 1947 the United Nations tried to partition the remaining Palestine mandate between Israelis and Palestinians. And when you talk about partitioning a place called Palestine between Palestinians and anyone else, you're begging the question of who are the rightful inhabitants of it and who are the outsiders. So is that what the United Nations really tried to do, to create Jewish and Palestinian states, like the media has said over and over? Actually, it didn't. If you read the Resolution 181, the famous partition resolution in 1947, it doesn't say Jewish and Palestinian states. It said we're trying to divide Palestine between its Arabs and its Jews into an Arab state and a Jewish state. And it uses those two expressions, Arab state and Jewish state, over and over and over again. Smoking guns. What about the expression, the Palestinians, that the media and even we use incessantly? What did the United Nations say in 1947 about the Palestinians? It said it hoped for peace and cooperation between the Jews and Arabs of Palestine, the two Palestinian peoples, not Jews and Palestinians, as if the Palestinian Arabs were the only ones. And the Associated Press in a lucid interval said a couple of years ago that during the Mandate, Muslims, Christians, and Jews living there were all referred to as Palestinians. So surrendering this name, the Palestinians, to the Arabs of Palestine is extremely detrimental, and as radical as it sounds, we should just stop using it. Call them Palestinian Arabs because that's what they are, just like Palestine's Jews are Palestinian Jews. Newt Gingrich was right about that. David Verlin, for many years, was the editor in the Jerusalem Post. And he wrote a column in the Jerusalem Post called Eye on the Media. And it was the pathfinder for Andrea Levin of Camera and for me and everybody else who is a media watcher on behalf of Israel against the mainstream media. He pointed out over and over again that during the Mandate, the names of the institutions that use the word Palestine in their title, Palestine Electric Company, the Palestine Symphony, even the Palestine Post, which is today's Jerusalem Post, all referred to Jewish, not Arab institutions. And Ezra Weitzman, when he served in the RAF, his shoulder patch said Palestinian. It didn't say Jew. The name Palestine itself is not a dirty word. People who wrote famous books that are pro-Israel books, pro-Jewish people books, about the land of Israel and the rights to it. James Parks was a British historian in the mid-20th century. He wrote a very famous book called Whose Land? And he said the history of the peoples of Palestine, including the Jews. Joan Peterson, from time immemorial, wrote the origins of the Arab-Jewish conflict in Palestine. And Samuel Katzer wrote the wonderful book Battleground. He called it Fact and Fantasy in Palestine. We shouldn't be afraid of the term Palestine. We shouldn't let the Arabs control it as if it only refers to them. That's why in my book I subtitled it The Jewish People's 3,000-Year Presence in Palestine. You've also heard the media use over and over again the expression the 1967 borders, but they were really just 1949 ceasefire lines. Well, does it make a difference? Yes, it makes a difference. And the reason it makes a difference is that in international jurisprudence, the term border has a gravitas, it has a permanence, it has a respect that a term ceasefire line, a military ceasefire line, does not. So when the media talks about Israel going back to the 1967 borders, they really mean the 1949 ceasefire lines, which are no holier than the 1967 post-1967 war ceasefire lines, and that's misleading. Here's a typical example. Inquirer ran a New York Times article. The New York Times, of course, is not balanced when it comes to Israel. It's imbalanced. The article in the New York Times said that some intellectuals in Israel said that Israel should go back to the 1967 lines, meaning the 1949 lines. And the Inquirer headlines, they urge peace based on the 1967 borders. It makes a difference because borders mean something that ceasefire lines don't. In 2010, the State Department, when Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State, the State Department issued a statement that said that what we're trying to do is to reconcile, that was their word, the Palestinian goal of having an independent Palestinian Arab state based on the 1967 lines with agreed swaps, and the Israeli goal of a Jewish state that has secure and recognized boundaries and takes into account post-1967 war demographic developments. When President Obama made his statement, I believe that the borders of Israel and Palestine should be based on the 1967 lines. He was adopting, of course, the Arab position, but he used the word lines in 2011 and not borders. But the Inquirer, for example, headlined, "Obama maps a peace path. The border should be based on the borders before the 1967 war." And they shouldn't have used that word borders, they should have used the word lines. These are those borders, quote unquote. This is why Abba Eban, who was a liberal, called them Auschwitz lines. I want to talk just a little bit about terrorism, and then I'll turn it over to Lee. Terrorism is much in the news today because of the, not tragedy, but terrorist attack that took place this week in Boston. The media likes to say that the roadmap, remember the roadmap that President Bush introduced? The media says that the roadmap calls on the Palestinian Arabs to rein in militants, to disarm and dismantle militants. Is that what the roadmap really says? No, it doesn't. The roadmap says over and over again forms of the word terror. It does not use the word militants at all. I added them up. It's 9 times for the times of terror and 0 times for militancy. And when the media talks about incidents, tragic, worse than tragic, terrorist incidents, like a couple years ago when Palestinian militants snuck into a settlement in Samaria and slit the throats in the dead of night of a father and a mother and 3 little kids. The media runs a story. Militants have defended previous such attacks, calling settlers combatants and not citizens and just plain people. These are the tanks of these settler combatants. This photo was taken by Lee's co-president of the local ZOA's wife the day after that happened in Samaria. And I think it captures as well as anything that settlers are not combatants. They're just people, and they're not settlers. They're residents in disputed places and not settlements. And that's not what the media calls it. This is in the news again today. In 1997, there was still is, I guess, a so-called peace park on the border between Israel and Jordan. And they call it a peace park. And in 1997, a 8th grade group of Israeli schoolgirls went there on a outing to see this peace park. And a Jordanian soldier standing on the border, on the Jordanian side, mowed them down with a gun. And he killed 7 of them, murdered 7 of them, and wounded the other 7. The Jordanians, to their credit, put this man in jail where he, of course, belonged, if not executed. And they kept him there for several years. And then a couple years ago, there was an uproar in the Jordanian parliament, such as it is, to free this man. And the Inquirer reported this as it should have reported it, but it headlined this not Israel rejects call to free murderer of Israeli schoolgirls, 7 Israeli schoolgirls. The Inquirer headlines, Israel rejects call to free soldier, as if the fact that he was a soldier and not a murderer is the reason that the Israelis objected to his being released. This week, there's another effort to free the man. I haven't seen anything Inquirer on it, but they shouldn't say Israel rejects call to free soldier. You may remember that Hamas fired a guided anti-tank missile at a school bus in Israel. And they hit the school bus because it can't miss when it's guided. And they killed a kid. And the Israelis responded against the people that fired that anti-tank missile at a school bus. The Inquirer headline, Hamas hit on Israeli bus draws retaliation. It wasn't a bus, it was a school bus. And a guided missile was used to hit it. And when Israel responded was not retaliation. Retaliation would have been, if you look in Webster, it's like for like, tit for tat, injury for injury. If Israel had targeted a school bus in Gaza, that would have been retaliation. But to go after the people in defense of your own citizens who perpetrate these terrorist acts, that is not retaliation, though the media says that over and over and over again. There's a lot more that I could tell you. Let me just give you one more example. Remember Sheikh Yassin? He was one of the co-founders of Hamas. And in January of 2004, in the middle of an article on something else, the Inquirer said also yesterday, the founder of Hamas said that they would start to recruit female, quote, suicide, unquote, bombers because Israel was stopping the male ones. That's what the man said. Recruit female suicide bombers because Israel was stopping the male ones. 2 months later, in a targeted killing, Israel took him out. What did the Inquirer headline, that op-ed page across the page? Did peace die with Sheikh Yassin? And I put in the Media Watch, rhetorically, did medical ethics die with Mengele? They also did a cartoon by Tony Auth, who has since departed the Inquirer, Israel strangling the peace stuff. So, does Israel get a fair shake on terrorism? No, it doesn't. I'll add one more, I promise I'll stop. The bomb that was used in Boston, the 2 bombs were packed with ball bearings and nails and other things intended to cause as much damage to the tissue of men, women, and kids as they could muster in these bombs that they did. A couple of years ago, Islamic Jihad blew up a bus stop in Jerusalem, and those bombs were packed with small ball bearings for the same reason. And Islamic Jihad said, we're going to continue, vowed to continue targeting cities deep inside Israel. What the public needs to have the media in the United States do is be as outraged over attacks on Israeli civilians with small ball bearings packed in bombs in bus stations as they are at marathons in Boston. There's a lot more I could tell you. I just want you to be alert when you read the newspapers and see if you can't help other people understand that Israel is not getting a fair shake, and it cuts all the way down, not just terrorism, but down to very survival when their delegitimization goes on. I thank you for your attention. I thank you.